Something I think about is over the past several years, there's an exercise I've been trying to build into my muscle memory for myself. The reactionary way that I tend to think about things. It doesn't make for the most fun, and it often leads me down alleys of thought that are rather lonesome. Lonesome because while I do find others that land on similar veins, the ideas are often drowned out by simple reductions. In episode 8 of this series with historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto, we discuss his point that bad ideas travel faster than good ideas. Good ideas are complex, often illogical at face value, and tend to dispel beliefs instead of enforcing them. In an attempt to try and see the good ideas over the bad ideas, I've tried to build up a habit for myself of looking for the system in any given thing. Not reducing something down to, oh, this happened because of X, but rather, what are all the intertwined factors that led to whatever event? The Soviet Union didn't fall because of the Berlin Wall coming down. There were many factors that were not out in the open, but nonetheless contributed to a fast fall of the entire empire. People behind closed doors, wanting an end to the regime, while openly still wearing red and flying the hammer and sickle. Something that at face value was very hard to see, and has been quantified or reduced down even there into an idea of preference falsification. Something I still think is just one aspect of it. This same exercise can be put onto the illegal drug market in the United States and the broader world. Why are there criminal enterprises that produce and traffic drugs? Because there's demand and money in it, certainly. But there's also money in fighting those elements. There's also a lack of opportunities in the areas where they're recruiting members into these criminal enterprises. Like Yoan Grillo highlights in my interview with him down in episode 20 of this series. Ideas and their conceptual vessel, words, start to take on lives of their own in ways we're largely unaware of. To keep using my point, like fish in water, once again that I stole from David Foster Wallace. These words can be devices to get a shared sense of understanding in order to communicate with each other. Like being able to express what food will cause an allergy. Having a word for that is great. But these same words can become traps for what they build up, instead of what the reality, what the system will convey, or actually is. The quote, government is a classic example of this. The government, as it's broadly put where people offhandedly say, quote, the government can't get their act together, is summarizing an incredible cohort of different individuals, independent agencies, and the mechanisms of control and cooperation therein. Another example of this is cartels. When I did episode 22 on the United States sugar cartel, yes, the United States operates a cartel, and it's on sugar of all fucking things. The most feedback I got on that was folks not realizing what the word cartel was. They thought it just meant a label for Latin American crime. The system that a quote cartel is trying to encapsulate when it comes to the illegal drug trade in Latin America is immense as it is complicated. Are there criminal elements in Mexico through Colombia and broader operating an illegal drug trade? Most certainly. But that's not the whole story. And like many things, when chaos occurs, it can be a device to achieve many other outside aims. Like in the case of Mexico, rather recently, using military to drive off indigenous people from their land. Shocker, because there's resources there. If the word cartel is such an overbloated conception, if it dwindles down and reduces something that in its reality is much more complicated and much more nuanced, does a cartel or do cartels even exist? Or is the reality something far different? That's what my guest for this episode, journalist and professor Oswaldo Zavala, discusses in his book, Cartels Don't Exist, and what we talk about in this interview. In this episode, we talk about what is a cartel, what's the history of cartels in Mexico, the rise of violence there, and the false stories pushed by media outlets to serve a narrative. This one for me was interesting to ponder, and one that, as calls for the US military to get more involved in Mexico, something that should be considered. And that's to say nothing of the disastrous effects the Mexican military has had attempting to do the same, something I don't understand how we could do any different. Thank you, Oswaldo, for coming on, and thank you for listening. Wherever this finds you on our big, blue, beautiful planet, I hope you're doing well. Take care. All right, I gotta do that cliche thing before the episode starts. If you like what you're hearing, please follow the show on whatever platform you're hearing it through. And if you would, give us a rating as well, as both of those help keep the show going and get it found. One last thing, if you want to submit a topic for me to cover, throw me a person you want me to interview or talk with, even if you want to talk with me, or you just want to tell me how terrible of a job I did on something, check out bandwidth.productions to visit the site and drop us a note. Again, if you wouldn't mind, just introduce yourself so we can get started.
My name is Oswaldo Zavala. I'm a professor and a journalist. I teach at the City University of New York, and I'm originally from Mexico.
Excellent. So I asked this first question to everybody when they first come on, which is, what do you like to do that makes you happy?
Oh, well, nowadays, I think I'm happiest when I'm with the children and my wife walking the dogs by the water. I think that's that's pretty much it. Or traveling, the four of us, somewhere remote that we haven't been, and maybe third of that, going to the theater with my daughter.
I love all of those answers. There's something to walking in particular, but also looking out at like big bodies of water. There's like,
Absolutely.
I think it's called like the blue ocean theory or something like that, of like how humans innately, like if we just look out at a big thing of water, we tend to get calmer and happier. I really
I'm
believe
just
in that.
yeah. It's all about I guess a combination of being calm and also super excited to hear my children's thoughts and trying to collect as many memories as possible before they get too big and walk out of here.
Yeah. Soak it all up as you can. I would
Right.
imagine that's got to be pretty nice, and experiencing all their thoughts and perspectives and their firsts. We're looking forward to
Exactly.
kids, and I'm really excited for like their first experience of certain things. You know, it's like you're
Right.
reliving your own, but also it's like they're like shocked at, oh my god, this is chocolate, or whatever it is.
Exactly. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. All right, so like I told you, I want to there's a couple angles I want to frame this up, but I like starting with definitions first. So if you wouldn't mind, give me an idea of what the modern conception kind of in the zeitgeist of what is the definition of a cartel, and then would you give me your definition of what a cartel is?
Sure. I think there's two mainstream conventional definitions of the cartel that I think can all that we can all perceive and perhaps have heard constantly through the media. One relates to economics, and the other one is more the matter of journalism and reporting, especially for foreign correspondents abroad. The first one, when people in economics refer to cartels, they usually have in mind the OPEC and the various debates that circled around the 1970s and 80s of oil producing countries and their domination in the world. And of course, a cartel, in those terms, it's a conglomerate of different oil producing countries combining their strengths to manipulate the price of the barrel, right? And so, in that sense, it speaks of collaboration, of a horizontal, I guess, companionship, and the ability to work together, right, and towards a common goal. But when the concept migrated to organized crime debates, and when the DEA started using it to describe drug producing organizations, in particular from Latin America, it had a very different connotation. This is, by the way, something that started appearing sometime around the 1970s, perhaps. It first used in congressional hearings when the DEA had to explain its own rationale for their operations in countries like Colombia, in particular, and Mexico. So when they started using the word cartel, they switched this definition of solidarity and collaboration into animosity and, and struggle. So, a cartel in the DEA terms is one organization that has supreme power and control over a certain part of a drug market, and that in order to expand beyond that territory, fights and combats other cartels, right? And so it's completely contrary to common sense from the economic perspective, right? So instead of collaboration, cartels fight among themselves, and they use all their strength and power to not only destroy the opponent, but to create some form of monopoly, right, of the drug trade. Now, my own definition is actually a pretty negative one, in the sense that I would like to walk away from it and first show the I guess the artificiality of the way, especially the second definition, is being used. So the in my own work, what I point out first is that the etymological original sense of cartel is completely distorted in the way the DA uses it now, but also that the word itself is more of a narrative device than an accurate description of any drug organization. And it is a narrative device precisely because, in order to justify its own operations and its expansive budget and its inherent violence when it operates in countries like Colombia or Mexico, the DEA must create a phantomatic or a phantasmic operation of a big drug organization that is in constant struggle, that is in constant, I guess, fight for dominion and turf, in that it has evolved into this diabolic, sinister, violently in blood seeking organization that it has to be somehow met in its own terms, right? So the cartel is depicted as this monstrosity that can only be faced or combated with a similar level of power and force. And so my critique to it is that, as a narrative device, not only it does not accurately describe drug organizations, but it is actually deployed to justify a budget, to justify the militarist presence of the global north and the global south, and that it ultimately transforms countries like Mexico and Colombia into battle zones, not because these organizations are necessarily fighting each other, but because we have normalized the presence of our own armed forces pursuing criminality, pursuing drug organizations, which in reality translates to affecting the social tissue of the most vulnerable populations in the country. And so, as my own research suggests, but I'm not, of course, I'm far from being the only one doing this. Um, the effects of the militarization in countries like Colombia and Mexico have, of course, been disastrous, in particular to the most impoverished populations, in particular to young and brown, uneducated men who have suffered the most and who have been consistently the victims of armed struggle and armed force.
Yeah, yeah, I could totally see that. Especially, it's just a constant war state in some of these areas. I
Right?
when I first saw your book, which I mentioned, I read in an article first of how cartels don't exist. What I first thought of, and now I'm thinking of again, is the United States actually has a sugar cartel. I've done an episode on it, but there's actually a cartel where the importation of sugar to the United States and even the growing of it and all of that, it's completely controlled, and that is a classic definition of a cartel. Or like
Absolutely.
OPEC with the oil, and I mean, nowadays you're hearing a lot of, are they cutting production? What are they doing? What's it going to do to global oil prices and all of that? And when you really take a step back and think of it that way, the term cartel, if it's in the Netflix Narcos series or whatever it may be, has been normalized, but it absolutely does not convey what is happening. Like we don't call the mafia a cartel if they just like own a neighborhood or a set of neighborhoods and they're shaking people down. But it's just is amorphous thing, but it's very useful, which is why I think definitions are important, because the words that we end up using inherently shape our perspective on the world. And if you
Absolutely.
just label it, oh, it's a cartel, and if it's the new generation cartel, oh yeah, they're just a cartel, and it completely obfuscates, well, that they're a emergent quality of this militarization, and now it's just an arms race, and it's an easy definition. So I like that you were saying again it's a narrative device. What's the trap of the narrative device? What's the use of it? Obviously for the militarization of it, but what is the I guess the unintended consequence of calling it? You mentioned like the most vulnerable communities, but you also mentioned in your book that there's this weaving of politics and government and corporations, and how does labeling it a cartel kind of change how it's reacted to, and yeah, I guess what's the trap of using it as a narrative device in relation to the broader spectrum of actually what's occurring with the cartels?
Well, I first would say that the effects of using the word have all been intended, right? And so they're all intended consequences. And the reason why we have a common and such a popular word like cartel among us and guiding our most basic debates about organized crime is because we very seldomly talk to or look at directly, I guess, the drug organizations and people working in organized crime. Right, we have very little experience in conversation and listening to what they do and to explain themselves. How is it that they operate? Because we have necessarily not only put a big social distance from those organizations and ourselves, but because of the prohibition itself has created that distance and has built almost a symbolic wall between what people do in the drug world and normalized social civil society, right? Um, and that happens because of this criminalizing narrative, right? We, for example, are able to talk to people who sell counterfeit jeans or Louis or fake Louis Vuitton bags or people who guide all kinds of informal economies all around us, right? I walk to Chinatown and I can speak to people who engage in all kinds of irregular commodities, right? That are sold on the streets. There's some guy selling, AirPod Max, fake AirPod Max from Apple, on Canal Street, and for a fraction of a price. And yes, of course, he's committing some form of illegal activity, but he's not a criminal in the sense that we imagine and we narrate drug organizations and people participating in them. And so, because of the criminality dimension, right, that the prohibition adds to it, we have very rarely talked to them directly. So they don't really explain themselves, and we have a lot of trouble trying to understand how their day-to-day operations work. And because of that emptiness, the prohibition itself offers this very attractive narrative, right, with all these fantastic elements to it that appears to explain to us what is it that they do, that appears to fulfill that emptiness of knowledge, right? And so they come to us with this, extraordinary structures of operations, right? You have the boss at the top, and then you have people around him like consultants or advisors. Then you have enforcers, and then kind of like troopers who sell the drugs and fight each other and whatnot, right? So you have this very almost too perfect structure, criminal structure that is constantly explained to us by institutions like the DEA, by our own Mexican anti-drug organizations, by military intelligence, and of course, all that is translated in a very narrative form by the reporters covering the drug war. And so, what is extraordinary is that the word itself, cartel, and its narrative implications have been repeated so much and have circulated with such consistency among us that they appear to be completely integrated into our own perception of reality. So when you walk around Mexico City, for example, and you ask, the a taxi driver or somebody selling food on a cart on the street, they all repeat to you pretty much the same mythology, right? Well, cartels run the country. Cartels are very powerful. They can challenge state structures. They overcome police institutions. They are so much obsessed with territorial power and money that they stop at nothing. And if they need to commit all kinds of atrocities, they will, because it's in their nature, right? They are not, they're no longer human. They appear to us as some form of supernatural monstrosity. And so that, what is extraordinary is that description that I just came up with has become the standardized version of what these organizations are all about. And it's not that just Netflix that peddles such imagery, right? It's mostly mainstream media first that legitimizes what official institutions are saying, that make it some, that give it some form of veracity, right, to official claims of what these drug organizations are about. And then from the mainstream explanations in the media, we have all kinds of cultural productions accepting that narrative and repeating it. Not just because we have no other source, but because we have collectively accepted what they say. And so it is very difficult to deviate from that, because if you do, most people would think that you're no longer in contact with that reality, right? That you are the one distorting it. So this is how Slavoj Žižek would explain ideology, right? Ideology is not, of course, some form of distortion, right? That only applies to you, right? Ideology, when it becomes dominant, when it becomes hegemonic, right? It's our own spontaneous perception of the world, right? And so the idea of the cartel as this powerful superstructure that challenges and effectively overcomes the state has become so ideologically dominant that if you attempt to question it, it seems almost as if you're questioning reality itself, right? And so the trap, to put it back to your question, is that we when we accept the word cartel and the narrative of the drug war, the way it has been um, I guess, articulated by official institutions, is that we then have accepted a different version of reality in which organized crime is the biggest culprit to most of the violence that is happening in places like Mexico or Colombia. And we stop looking at other sources of that violence, right? In particular, in my country, the presence of the military, right? We have heavily militarized Mexico, not only growing the budget, but deploying thousands of soldiers and police officers all over the country. And they have consistently committed crimes against society, crimes against humanity for the last 17, 18 years since this so-called drug war began. And what is then extraordinary, right, is that we, even though there's more and more increasing voices of people criticizing the military, we still think and make it a central topic of discussion, that drug cartels are the main source of the violence, right? That those organizations are the ones that we need to look at. And by doing that, we keep legitimizing the presence of the military, which, in my view, is the real condition of possibility of the violence. Right. So we every time we accept the drug war narrative, we are accepting at the same time what the implicit solution, right, to this violence, which is the military presence, which of course is the first enabler of the violence.
Yeah, that's a very thorough walkthrough. I appreciate that. It makes me think of this. It's like a little funny, pithy statement, but it works nonetheless. It's from The Simpsons, and it's the line is Homer saying, "Alcohol is the cause of and solution to all of life's problems," and it makes me think of that here, where it's like the military, it's the cause of and the solution to all of these problems. Well, it's not the sole cause though, which I think we're going to get into.
Right.
I really love when I asked you about the name, you said it's actually intended consequences, which is awesome. When I said unintended, and it makes me think a lot of Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent,
Sure.
and like the five filters and all of that. But this seems like such a complete version and encapsulation of it, of really shaping public opinion to see it in a particular way. And you have the news media on one hand, more or less parroting what the government is saying. I think it's on both sides of the issue. And then you have like the Netflixes of the world, with the drug cartels and explaining them that way, sure. But I think something else that you brought up that's important to highlight is they're also in a sense glorifying drug use or things like that, which is one way of talking about the issue, which is there's a demand side to the drugs. But instead of talking about it, we more just visualize it in whatever it is. Like I think it was like Crocodile Dundee, like in that movie in the 80s, way back when he like shows
Right.
somebody how to free ball cocaine in it, which is just wild. Like he literally shows you how to do it in the movie, and it's just some random adventure comedy. But we don't think about that. Once again, there's a demand side. um and I want to ask you something. Do these drug organizations, because that's the word, if there's a better word to use, let me know, but I'm gonna, for right now, just say these drug criminal organizations, uh do they run the country? Because there's a lot of talk that they do, and
Of course they
like,
don't.
okay.
Of course they don't. They don't, and they never have, and they never will. Right. And there's sort of plenty of reasons to validate what I just said. And I know it goes counter to what most people perceive in mainstream media. But the first reason why they don't is because they don't make as much money as we are led to believe. Right.
Hmm.
We have surrounded ourselves not only with the violence attributed to these organizations, but with the money making capabilities that official institutions attribute to. And the reality is far disappointing when you look at it directly. There's an article that I like to refer that was published in 2019 by the Washington Post, in one of those very brief lucid moments of U.S. journalism, when they try to fact check for once how much money can we really validate or somehow accurately attribute to drug organizations in Latin America. And they do this because a congressional, a senator, a Republican senator in that year, I'm not going to, I think it's Senator, if I'm not mistaken, Purdue, but David Purdue, said in a congressional hearing that Mexican cartels made annually over $500 billion. And not only that's just a ridiculous figure, but in order for cartels to be able to make such an amount of money, they would have to have the same level of operations of Walmart, right? Which is the only transnational conglomerate that can um, accurately claim to make such a figure. But of course, for Walmart to be able to do that, right, they have to have a consistent, hassle-free operation, right, where there's no military trying to undo a Walmart store, right, every time they open one. But not only that, we know for a fact, and this is, of course, a combination of data and figures from not just the U.S. but other countries, right? That also attempt to accurately describe how much money drug organizations make. We have more serious attempts to do it, right? So one of them comes from the United Nations Office for Drug Control, and what they came to assess when looking at the cocaine market, because of course nowadays to think of marijuana is just ludicrous, right? Marijuana is no longer um, a commodity for transnational smuggling, right? The U.S. now has, of course, decriminalized the usage of cannabis in over, what is it, 35, 40 states of the union. By the way, creating an extraordinary industry, right? Legal industry of cannabis. That in itself, let's also understand that makes more money than the illegal cocaine industry altogether, right? So according to the UN Office of Drug Control, um, the cocaine market makes anywhere between about 8 to 30 billion dollars. But if you see the range, right, and the impossibility of claiming a particular figure is because A, we just simply cannot know, but B, there are all kinds of factors that make it necessary that such fluctuation exists, right? In one determinate year, in one every year, the cocaine operations change, right? It's impossible to have consistency, right? Some organizations continue, some are dismantled. Many organizations are popping up, in a very transitory, very improvised way. They have to rely on all kinds of actors and operators, right? So the idea of a one single structure, operating in the entire continent is a complete fantasy, right? What you have is all kinds of small producers sending different kinds of product, hoping some will make it, accepting huge losses in their products, and making as many possible gains as they can, but of course greasing an industry of bribery and small time operations and smuggling, that of course in the end the return is not very substantial, right? It's substantial of course for people who live by that business, but it's not substantial as to create extraordinary wealth in the hands of very few, right? So according to the UN, you have about anywhere between 8 to about 30 billion, but that's the entire cocaine market, right, including Colombian and Mexican organizations. So if then you want to translate that into the personal fortune of a trafficker, then you have to accept that you're talking about a much smaller fortune, right? When Forbes magazine attempted to do the same thing, right? Well, let's look at the wealth of the traffickers. They turned to Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, right? Which back then, in the early 2000s, well, I think he started appearing if I'm not mistaken, in the list or sometime around 2008, 2009, and they attributed to his personal fortune about $1 billion, right? And back then, 1 billion would put you in spot 702, right, of the Forbes list of the billionaires of the world. 702, right? Along with all kinds of people whose names you and I won't even recognize, right? Because a lot of people in today's global economy have 1 billion. Now, if you look at the list, in order to make the list, you have to have at least 1 billion. Now that would place you, I think, in if I'm I last time I saw it, it was a long while ago, so I don't remember it well, but I think it's in place 1,500 something, right? So they really push way back because a lot of people now have over $1 billion, and it's not a matter of anyone's surprise that wealth has concentrated in so many different hands, that a lot of people now are capable of creating 1 billion for their own personal savings account. So if you then look back at the official data on the drug trafficking world, then you come to see that having $1 billion as a personal as personal wealth means very little, right, in today's economy. But even Forbes back then in 2013 had to accept that that calculation was very optimistic, that it was very difficult for anybody in the position of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman to even continue to hold on to $1 billion when you have the armies of two countries and plus Interpol and mass technological surveillance and etc. after you, right? And so they ended up they decided that to expel him from the list was only logical because they just could not believe anymore the official data. And this is the point where the fantasy must be taken to the task, right? How is it possible, really, that we believe that a man, who was really pursued, hunted like an animal, right, for decades, right, who's been, in the cross hairs of both the Mexican and the U.S. military, can really hold on to any significant amount of money in order to survive, right? So when he was finally convicted and tried in New York, the most money that the DEA could actually show, right, and to demonstrate that uh, at some point was part of his operation was about $14 billion, right? But $14 billion throughout his entire career, right? For over 20 years of operation, right? So if you put that money in average, it's far less than 1 billion. But this is money not that he had in personal accounts. This is money that the DEA confiscated, that the DEA seized either in cash or in product, right? Throughout this over 2 decades of operations. So it's just completely absurd, right, to believe that money had amounted to anything important. And just to give you again another interesting comparison, right? So you have, for example, the cannabis industry making over $20 billion annually now, right? So in 1 year, the cannabis industry makes more than El Chapo's entire career, um, by, of course, comparing the figures that they could demonstrate in court. But also, and this is one of the topics that I think we often miss when we talk about the drug trade, the security industry that gains these extraordinary contracts, right, for the intelligent towers, for cameras, or for sensors, for drones, for arming the border patrol, and for sending drones into Mexico, of course, for software, for intelligence, for surveillance, etc. Uh, is the actual money making machine of this entire tale, right? When you look at how much money they adjudicate for the security industry, for companies like Northrop Grumman, for Elbit Systems, for Lockheed Martin, all these companies. By the way, many of them is Israeli in origin. Then you get an extraordinary terrible vision, right, of the business of war, right? And this is where this is why, for example, some journalists have started to make the association between what is going down right now in Gaza and what happens in places like the U.S. Mexico border, right? So you have this tremendous tension between a discourse of national security pointing at the monstrosity of drug cartels in Mexico, and pointing at terrorism in the Middle East, right? And that in the end serves to justify an extraordinary machinery of weapons, surveillance systems, and crimes against humanity that has become the real source of income, right, for transnational armed companies, right, and people involved in that sector. And so, going back to this question, the reason why I cannot for a second believe that drug cartels can really have any form of control in the territory in Mexico is because, A, they just simply cannot compete as a transnational business, right? They don't make that much money. They cannot control consistently money flows. B, the reason why we are even talking about them is because they justify a more successful business making world, which is the security world, the companies that guide security in places like the U.S. Mexico border, and and because in the end, all these traffickers end up either dead or in prison, right? And so it's very difficult to believe, right, that an organization with not compete with resources that do not compete with those of the state, that is constantly hunted down, and that in the end it's destroyed permanently, can hold on to any form of control to the territory, right? So it's just completely nonsensical, right, to accept the official narrative. And the only reason you and I are discussing it now is because it's repeated over and over in mainstream media, because official institutions make that claim, and it's not a verifiable claim. And this is why our media has failed us, right? They've forgotten to verify those claims, and so that's why I just wanted to quote that Washington Post article, because it's really interesting when you attempt to do the fact checking, then you realize that is it's just not much money that we're talking about. And I'll end with this. I know I tend to do this very long explanations. I apologize for that, but I'll end with this part of the interview with an interview that I did once with a famous economist who was just talking to me about what the drug money meant in the world of world economics, right? And so I asked him directly, so do you think organized crime money has any significant presence in world economic affairs? And he just bluntly responded, "Look, I do not know anyone serious in the world of economics who believes for a second that organized crime money amounts to anything relevant. They have no say in the world economy. They're not part of any table. They're not a presence. It's a fraction of the world economy, and it makes very little relevance, very little importance to the world, that clandestine, what that clandestine economy does or could do, right? In general terms, and that for me is very dumb."
Yeah, it is, as well as the $500 billion from
From
from the politician. That's
right.
leave it to politician to miss the mark by that much. But $500 billion would have been like in the top 10 of GDP of countries in the world if I'm not
Right.
like doing my math wrong.
Absolutely.
That's absolutely hysterical.
But those
Yeah,
figures are claimed like that, right? All the time.
yeah, and I mean, when you say like to go back to manufacturing consent, you say the media is failing us, and they're failing the public good, but they're definitely serving those who hold their purse strings very well, which I think goes back to the military industrial complex and
Right.
having such a profitable industry for war means. Um, it's interesting what you're saying, because what you're essentially saying is the narrative is false. Sure, they make money. I mean, it's not trivial. Even if he made less, let's just say $900 million a year for 20 years, that's not trivial. But when you think about, it's like holding on to sand.
Right.
You got to keep moving. Like, how can you be holding on to something as you keep moving? You got to keep greasing the wheels, and it's a completely decentralized system. You're also doing, it's like the morality of drug use side of it. There's definitely some, what I would say is unethical and unmoral things they're doing along the way, which just means you can't trust anybody, which means money's going to be flying out the door already.
All the
So
time. Right.
yeah, it's every step of the process is just, more sand is being lost. And then finally the guy at the end, sure, he's a pile of cash, but he has to constantly be moving. And, there's not like a beach in Tahiti he can go to just like retire and kick up his feet. Which is really, really important.
I
I
was
think it's
just
an important
remembering.
point.
I was just remembering when you were saying this, an episode of The West Wing. I'm a big fan of The West Wing, even though, of course, it's a source of of mythology of the U.S. Political world. But I don't know if you ever seen the series. But
Oh,
um,
yeah, I've seen all of it. It's a lovely fantasy.
it's a completely lovely fantasy, and I love every second of it. But at some point, one of the characters is describing the national budget, right, and the budget they have in particular for infrastructure, right, and he compares it. I think it's a famous um, metaphor to moving a leaky bucket. Right, and so water is leaking everywhere. Right, so money, of course, is going to keep leaking every time you try to push money around in the bureaucratic world of infrastructure, right? Of state infrastructure. I think in the drug market economy, it's not even a bucket; it's your hands, right? You're trying to move
Yeah.
water with your hands, right? Not even a spoon, not even some form of container, right? So every time you try to move that money around, it's just completely disappears. You end up with a few drops on your palms.
Right. No, I think that's a great metaphor. I want to ask a bit of a follow up to that. So there's talks that these organized crime uh, groups will assassinate politicians, and that's it's one of the bigger things that's being talked about now, and kidnappings as well, which is I think it was I can't remember the congressman's name. He's from Texas, and he wears an eye patch. It's like a former
Right.
Navy SEAL, but he was like when there was Crenshaw, that's his name. When
Right.
there
Right.
was some people that were kidnapped, he was talking about bringing the U.S. military in there, which is against the Mexican Constitution. I don't think he really cared that much about that. But I immediately was pretty upset by that because I'm like, oh, okay, so we're just gonna ignite a war on the southern border in which we have such a shared cultural tradition and shared familial ties. Like I don't think he realizes the rat's nest he's about to kick up. But that is a narrative, the assassinations of politicians, the kidnappings of individuals, the human trafficking and all of that. How does that play in, and how much of a magnifying glass is being put on that versus I don't even know what the opposing to that would be.
Right. Well, I mean, again, I could engage in a very long explanation. I'll try to make it shorter this time. But I think the first thing I would say is that for the work of historians and journalists and sociologists in Mexico who have looked at the drug trade for decades, what you can see is that historically they do not engage in extreme atrocities or violence the way we think of or we have led to believe that they do. Right? When you look at what drug organizations did in the 1970s and the 1980s, the first thing to understand is that they would always work under the protection of the state, right? And they would have to do that because the military and the federal police had a very strong hold of the territory. And organized crime could not really operate without their some form of approval from official institutions, right? And there was a strong policy of drug control, not eradication, that successfully put them in check. So much that by the 1980s, they were doing the government's bidding, right? They were people working within the system. They provided all kinds of help and support to state structures. In exchange, they would get some protection, but that this did not mean a horizontal partnership, right? But rather more of a employee-employer interaction, right? So the traffickers, if you will, were the employees of a very sinister system that allowed them to exist, right? In exchange of favors and I guess participation in the clandestine activities of the government, and so much that that in the 1980s, the U.S. itself had made them a recourse, right? So it is widely discussed now that the CIA most likely used money from traffickers and weapons and even properties that the traffickers owned in Mexico to train Contra soldiers to send to Nicaragua, right? And knowingly they engage in their resources because they could not support Contra fighters directly because of Congress uh, locks on U.S. aid, right, for the Contra effort. So that perhaps is very telling of how drug organizations function back in the day. Now, what happened is that sometime in the mid 1980s, U.S. national security policy migrated and changed and left behind the Cold War mentality because they correctly understood that it was about to be extinguished, right? By the late 1980s, it was no longer believable, right, that the U.S. was fighting global communism in places like I don't know, El Salvador or Honduras or Nicaragua, and now especially with the Berlin Wall falling, they could not really anymore validate Cold War mentality. So the drug organizations appear now as the new enemy, designated as the new threat of national security in the 1980s during the Ronald Reagan administration. And because of that, then you have the rise of not the cartels, but the drug war and the militarization. Um, uh, Coming all kinds of places in Mexico and Colombia, and gradually we pushed to this war against drug organizations, to the point that by the 1990s, the military budget doubled up. The presence of soldiers and generals in even in local police precincts or state police organizations was increased. And so, what is then extraordinary is that if you look at murder rates in particular in Mexico, um, even with the rise of the militarization in the 1990s and the 2000s, you see a clear descent in murders, right? So, Mexico started systematically counting murders sometime around 1992, 1993. And from 1997 to 2007, what you see all nationwide is that murders were actually decreasing in Mexico, right? Even in the hotbeds of the drug cartels, right? Like Ciudad Juarez, which is, by the way, my town of origin, right? I was born and I grew up in Ciudad Juarez, right at the U.S. Mexico border, and I can attest to that, right? So all throughout the 90s and throughout the first years of the 2000s. The murder rate was actually declining to the point that in 2007, our national murder rate was pretty comparable to that of the US, right? We were talking about 9 killings per 100,000 inhabitants, right? The US murder rate, I think at that time was somewhere around 7 or 7 point something killings per 100,000. So we were not that far away from it. And the murder rates in many cities were actually lower than in plenty of US cities, right? Like Baltimore or Houston or LA. So the only thing that changed is not that, as some journalists would claim, the cartels, became very skilled at their trade, and they wanted more turf, and they wanted more presence, and they started fighting each other, and that's what triggered the violence. What triggered the violence was the deployment of the military, right? So if you look at the murder rates in the country, up until 2007, they keep decreasing, and then suddenly they spike in 2007, exactly at the cities and the regions where the Mexican government deployed its military. And we see not just a significant increase, but we see a monstrous spike, right, in places like Ciudad Juarez, for example, right. In my city, in 2007, were about 343 killings that year. By 2010, 3 years later, we were looking at over 3,000 killings that same year, right? So over a 1,000 percent increase. And it's just ludicrous to think that somehow, El Chapo people came to town and started shooting everyone, because what you look at, especially from journalistic accounts of people who lived in Juarez, who know the city well, who are not just parachuting and talking to a fixer who tells them what they want to hear, right? But people who know the city well, they will tell you they never saw cartels fighting. They saw paramilitary forces kidnapping shooting people, torturing people, and of course, military then overt public military presence taking over control of the city. So we have narrativized cartels as the doers of violence with very little verification in the process. And what we come to understand now is a couple of things. One, that the military presence has damaged profoundly social tissue, and that's why violence has escalated. But also, I think, and this is one of the important aspects of this discussion that I think I would like to bring to the table every time I talk about my own work, is that as Mexico was militarized and pushed into this drug war, there was also a parallel process of opening energy resources, and the extractive industry was hugely benefited by the militarization of the country in different regions. And I'm not alone in claiming this, right? There's been work by important journalists from in Mexico and from abroad. I'm thinking, for example, the work of Canadian journalist Don Paley, who worked an extraordinary book called Drug War Capitalism, which in many ways summarizes this point of view, right? So what she has come to understand is that the geopolitics of security, of national security, threats, and the military response to national security threats, not only in Mexico, but in Central America and in Colombia, intimately relates to extractive projects and extractive industry, right? So wherever we talk about cartels in Mexico, sometimes we're really talking about gas extraction, minerals, oil, even water, right? So in the state of Tamaulipas, for example, I was able to compare maps of the territory that supposedly was under the control of the Zetas, right? The infamous Zetas, the former military special group that formed its own cartel, according to official claims. And their territory in the Gulf of Mexico coincided almost perfectly with the one of the largest gas reservoirs in the hemisphere, right? The Burgon Basin, which is it's so important and so big, and provides shale gas to not just the U.S. Mexico border, but fuels energy all over the Southwest. And what is extraordinary then is to understand, right, how is it that in a part of a country where the Zetas supposedly control, right, where they put politicians to their pleasing, to have overcome and surpass the state structures and the military presence. How is it that Chevron engineers or BP oil can do their job, right? How is it that the extractive industry continues, right? And not only thrives, but systematically maintains business as usual, as the country is apparently falling apart, right? One of the national journalists in Mexico a few years back showed, for example, that in the midst of the most gruesome cartel wars in the 2000s, the Peña Nieto government, actually 2013, 2014, the Peña Nieto government laid out one of the biggest infrastructure deals in history, which was a pipeline that began right there at the Burgos Basin, where they were extracting gas, shale gas, and the pipeline went all throughout across the U.S. Mexico border, all the way to Tijuana, right to California, unstopped, and completely. Successfully laid out and finished the project that runs to this day, right? And somehow, they were able to, go through cartel wars and turf battles and the absence of the state and this infamous cartel activity. And so, going back to your question, it is very, I think, incomplete or how would I say it, inaccurate to just simply think of violence and drug cartels and to believe that proxy itself explains violence in the country, right? What you have is a thriving extractive industry on one hand. You have also all kinds of deals for the exploitation of natural resources in the country that happen exactly at the regions of the most gruesome conflict. And that association is not always made by most, or actually rarely made by mainstream journalists, right? And you have to start thinking in those terms, because um, any good reporter would tell you, right, when you're on site and you're seeing this violence, and right next door, there's a Canadian company exploiting mineral, as in the state of Guerrero, for example. Then a logical question arises, right? How is it possible, right, that cartels are killing students in Ayotzinapa, and next door, the extractive industry is just functioning as nothing is happening, right? And how is it possible, right, that we accept and believe that traffickers are really in control of the entire nation, when Mexican economy is actually very strong and thriving. The peso, it's actually gaining ground. It's about 17, 16 pesos right now. In general, right, the macroeconomic indicators are, very function. Mexico City is a city for U.S. expats now. Half of New York City has moved to Mexico City, Condesa and Roma, and so you have all these contradictions at play, right? And so some journalists will tell you, well, because of course, cartels have not made it to Mexico City. No, drugs have always had a presence in our country historically since the early 1900s, right? We have had drug organizations operating as early as the late 19th century, right? And we know for a fact, and because we keep a systematic count, that the violence associated to the traffickers was only detonated and only really became an issue with the militarization of the country. And yet, you have most mainstream reporters overlooking that mere fact, setting it aside, and naturalizing drug violence as if has always been happening in the country, as if we have only talked about that for the last 100 years, which is, of course, not true.
Yeah, that's a really interesting reframing. Um, Both of the deploying of the military and what that did. Every action is a reaction, and what that actually did to spark more violence. And I mean, violence isn't good for business for drug cartels. I wouldn't imagine. I've actually thought that a lot, because the
Right.
more violence you do, the more heat you get. It makes it harder once again to move that sand from place to place. But it's
And
interesting the way that you're
I'm
saying,
sure
because
you've seen
Mexico's
the videos.
economy.
Oh,
Oh, the
I'm
videos
sorry. I'm
of
sorry. I interrupted. I says I couldn't hear you.
Oh yeah, no. Where I was going with that is, Mexico's economy is booming and thriving, and extraction of resources and just general infrastructure seems to be going around just fine. So where is all of this stemming from, which is interesting. I also think I don't want to derail it too much. I think I learned recently I can't remember the name of the railway, but it goes from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. And AMLO recently christened it not that long ago. But I was hearing that he actually used the military to seize land from indigenous people in various areas over there to build a railway, which now is making me think about how that may be deployed in other means for resource extraction. Do you have time for one more quick question?
Absolutely, please.
Okay. What would you do to influence the direction of these drug organizations, the general state of politics? In other words, if I was to wrap it up into a large and ambiguous enough question, what would you do to improve the situation if you had? I want to say that means if you had like a wish or a desire or a way to improve the situation. What is it that you would consider doing?
Well, I mean, the first thing that I would say is that we are in this situation not because of drug activity, but because of our national security agenda that has followed U.S. Directives of militarization, right? So we are in this mess because we militarized our country because we pushed our country to become a war zone where the military is deployed, where the military commits crimes against humanity, and where we have criminalized the most impoverished sectors of the country. Um, the first move, of course, would any thinking, even I guess significantly informed citizen would have to accept is that we need to decriminalize the consumption of drugs, right? The production and circulation and consumption of drugs, right? We need to decriminalize the drug market. That, of course, is a no brainer, right? Anybody with any um, decency and common thinking capabilities should come to accept. This has already happened in other countries, more significantly in Portugal, right, where the decriminalization of drugs has not resulted in an increase of users or addictions. It is actually brought down addiction and all kinds of other health issues associated with drug usage, right? The spread of disease, etc. So decriminalization is a step, an elemental step towards the pacification of the country. But the problem here is that the drug trade is no longer uh, just doing that, and this is where it gets tricky, right? So, U.S. Agencies like the DEA, the State Department, of course, but in Mexico, the military and our own anti-drug organization, anti-drug agencies claim that drug cartels have already diversified. Right, they are now no longer just engaged in the drug trade, but they also control human smuggling. They control the oil theft. They control the avocado contraband. Right,
I was
they
about to
are
say
everywhere.
avocados, dude. It always
Right,
comes up avocados. The Super Bowl that
avocados. Right,
happened not that long ago.
sure,
Yeah, the
sure.
guacamoles from the cartels. Yeah, that's what
Exactly.
I was hearing that all over the
So
place. Yeah, go ahead.
So the problem is because cartels, as we began saying, right, have been conceived as a narrative device. They can be reformulated, right, and the story can be retold, and it's been recast already, right. So according to the DA, the drug organizations are no longer just about drugs. So if you decriminalize drugs, sure, you take away a big chunk of their business, but they keep existing, right? They're going to keep thriving because now apparently using the word cartel really refers to all kinds of criminality, right? It's a it's a one model fits all, right? Word. So when you use that word, you just simply basically referring to the underworld in Latin America, right? And so you can take away the drug game, but unless you somehow prevent human migration, human smuggling will keep being there, right? Unless somehow hipsters in Brooklyn stop eating avocado toast, the avocado contraband is going to be there also. And so the problem with this narrative device of the cartel is that it doesn't have to stop at any particular product. So in order for really making a dent into the what others have called securitarian violence, right, violence attributed to the national security paradigm, we need to interrupt the security state altogether, right. We need in Mexico in particular, we need as a policy to distance ourselves from the narrative security agenda of the US. And it's, of course, a very difficult thing to do in many ways. In a very naive way, I'm calling right for the interruption of the national security paradigm that prevails all throughout the global north, all the way to Mexico. But it's really the only way that we can significantly do something about the violence, because the violence, once again, right, is not the result of underground criminal forces, is the result of above ground militarist entrepreneurship, right? The military industrial complex, the extractive industry, the geopolitical presence of transnational interest from the global north into the global south. We just simply have come to accept the public name that they use to their operations, right? And they call it the drug war, right? But in reality, this comes down to the dispute over natural resources, to force displacement, the taking over of land rich in minerals and gas, land that is even repurposed for clean energies, right? For example, you have now the mass displacement of indigenous communities in Oaxaca, right, where they installed turbines for wind power, right, and without even paying a cent to those displaced communities, right? So here we are in the global north wanting green energy, pushing corrupt Mexico for not having, expanded into green energy already. And But when they do, they don't do it to benefit the Mexican population, right? They benefit the transnational economies who use then that green energy, right, for their own activity. And the same, can be said altogether about just every single aspect of the global economy, right? So Mexico is just being pushed to accept progress altogether at the expense of its own national interests. One of the big debates, for example, that is happening right now is that President Lopez Obrador wanted to open a sixth oil refinery, right? So Mexico has been operating with five refineries. He's opening a sixth one, and it's trying to work. It hasn't been completely fully functional, but it's been a big debate. The right has opposed the project, claiming that Mexico is stuck in the past, not wanting to see reality. We need to move into greener, cleaner energy. And they say this, of course, as the U.S. has over, 100 or 200, I think, refineries all over the country, right? and when the U.S. continues to run on oil, right, when the entire global north keeps using oil, right, and we're telling Mexico, stop, you must adapt to the new times, right, and keep, by the way, giving us your crude oil because we'll refine it for you. And so we have this entire debate, right, about progressive thinking that, of course, we support as progressive people. We are, of course, I want clean energy. Of course, I object to the pollution of the world. But the global north forces in our country have continues to I guess exhaust its resources, taking over its most precious raw materials. And by the way of doing that, they have pushed us into civil war, right? They have pushed us into the militarization. They had pushed us in a paradigm of prohibition that is not even ours to begin with. um, and they allow themselves to continue to pollute the world, to create a cannabis industry that is billions of dollars richer, right? And even that has been object of contempt, right? Mexico has not been able to engage in the legal cannabis industry because the U.S. keeps sabotaging it, and so Mexico is not even allowed to have its own cannabis legal industry, national industry, because it would compete with the Canadian and the US one, right? So even to that point, we have come down to this asymmetrical national security paradigm, right? And so going back to your question, how do we get out of this? Well, I don't think we can, but if we could, right, the only way to do it would be to detach ourselves from this national security mentality, right? From this securitarian paradigm that keeps criminalizing the poor, that keeps making my country into a war zone, that keeps selling weapons, that keeps the hugely lucrative arms industry going. And once we do that, maybe perhaps we can start thinking of our own national interests, right? Of sure, keeping in mind not polluting the world, uh, using our oil, right? Refining some of our oil for our own benefit, even if it's just a small amount, right? Keeping close tabs to our own natural resources like gas and minerals, right? And stop the global theft that happens in our country, right? But instead, right? You and I have devoted this entire show, to keep talking about this one fantasy that keeps justifying the presence of a transnational arms industry and and the transnational global industrial military industrial complex in Mexico.
Yeah, I like that breakdown a lot, and it makes me think of this Victor Hugo line of what's the most what's more powerful than all the armies of the world stacked on top of each other, and the turn of it is an idea whose time has come. And what I'm hearing here is that the idea of national security state. The way that I like to add on to that is what's the second most powerful thing in the world, and it's an idea whose time is yet to pass. And I think what we're hearing here is the idea of a national security state. It hasn't passed yet, and
Oh no.
the fallout of that and the complexity of it. I like thinking of things in complex systems and the complexity that breeds, and obviously human suffering, but also in obfuscating opportunities for other things like material extraction or contradictions. Like the United States, globally is not cool with anybody legalizing marijuana because it can't seem to ignore the industry. Also, the whole states' rights divide of what are you going to do, but not just kind of playing the political football with it. While externally, the American empire is doing quite a bit to make sure that doesn't happen other places, because
Sure.
in my opinion, I think the drug war is just all too profitable and all too useful. Which I think what you're saying is in a large way supporting it. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate everything, your responses, and taking the time out of your day to chat. Um, is there anything else you want to say before we conclude?
No, I just wanted to thank you for the invitation. And one thing you said that right at the end that I think in many ways uh, keeps describing these terrible times that we live in is that we still live in the world of empire, right? We still live in the world of transnational empire, not perhaps the idea of a 19th century empire, right, that takes over territories abroad, but that it expands in domination and hegemony, right? So our world of empire has allowed the coexistence of magnificent cities like Mexico City and many other places in the country that are aimed at preserving livelihood of the elites, right? And a beautiful place for people in the middle upper class to enjoy, while parts of Mexico are going through hell, right? And this hell is completely preventable, right? And this hell exists because we have normalized these narratives that criminalize the youth, that criminalize the circulation of drugs, of course, to the extreme that that some human life is no longer um, um, valued, right? And that we have come to accept the normalization of killing, right, in the name of the prohibition, right? So we have over 500,000 victims of this drug war. And that figure itself, is, I don't think it's repeated enough, right? We have had already over 470,000 killings and over 100,000 forced disappearances because of this drug war. And since this supposed drug war began in 2007, so I just want to keep that in perspective. And yes, again, uh, invite our audience to reflect on the fact that we still live in a world where transnational interests um, mandate killing as part of the business, and this is a horrible empire world that we have uh, come to accept and normalize, and perhaps it's time that we stop normalizing.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think the world of empire. I think empires in general as an idea or a concept, in a lot of ways, is somewhat a emergent quality of our human behavior of civilizations, and I think it's one that we should be aware of so that we can transcend it. If I would be so bold as to say that. And the times we live in now is it still existed. I think we've just done a great job of creating an elephant in our brain to ignore the fact that the empire hasn't really gone away. It's just changed, and now it's one of commerce and multinational corporations and in a lot of times, in a lot of ways, those corporations even supersede the ideas of country or loyalty or a sense of community, which is really what a country was supposed to be, is a larger sense of community of organizing to a cause. Well, thank you so much. I'll definitely put in the show notes all the ways to get in contact with you, and I really appreciate your time. We can wrap in a second, but I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be part of this conversation.
Sweet. That